This podcast is for information purposes only and is not and should not be construed as professional advice or an offer or commitment by any Rabobank Group member to enter into a transaction. The views expressed by the presenter and or guests are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Rabobank. Please see the podcast description for our full disclaimer. There was a time that discussion about climate risk, largely related to the amount of rain or maybe lack of it, you are likely to receive for the coming season. Nowadays, however, it feels like a term that is used to refer to a whole range of factors that could potentially impact your farming business, and certainly a lot broader than a discussion around rainfall. But what exactly are these climate risks that we keep hearing about? How will they potentially impact your farming or growing operation? And is it all about risk? Where are the opportunities in all of this? I'm your host, Blake Holgate, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Rob Siveter, who, as Rabobank's Senior Manager for Sustainability Risk, has the job of helping the bank understand all the ways that climate risk could potentially impact the bank and its clients, and the opportunities that it could present to both. Rob, welcome to Growing Our Future podcast.
Thanks, Blake. Thanks for having me.
Now, before we crack into it, we always like to get to know our guests a little. I know you reasonably well, but our listeners don't. So what I'll get you to do is just tell us a little bit about yourself, your career to date, and your current role with Rabobank.
Sure, yeah, okay. So I'm, as you might be able to hear from my accent, I'm originally from the UK, grew up in rural Leicestershire, and then I had in my former life, for my sins, I was a computer software engineer, computer nerd, some people might have called me. But since then, I made the move into sustainability. Went back to university and studied environmental management. So that has taken me on my journey now, where I spent around 10 years back in the UK, working for the international oil and gas industry, actually, helping them to work on climate change. And then more recently, over in NZ, working for financial services, an insurance company, and now Rabobank. So at Rabobank, I'm the Senior Manager for Sustainability Risk. And I guess that involves me looking at all of the risks and opportunities that the bank is exposed to from climate change and wider environmental and social issues, but also and that's included working on our disclosures and doing things like scenario analysis. Interesting stuff for someone like me, at least.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that a bit more as we go through the podcast, Rob, and you touched on it in your intro, but at a high general level, can you give us an overview of what the term ESG risk, we hear that increasingly, ESG risk, and companies like ourselves and others starting to take it into consideration. What is it and why is it relevant to the bank and its clients?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really like the term ESG risk, right? Because immediately you're starting with some confusing technical acronym. So ESG is environmental, social, and governance. But really, I think, I prefer to just say sustainability risk, and that covers, yes, the environmental dimension, but also the social dimension, right? And not forgetting the kind of impacts that any business has on the wider economy as well. So that's what it comes down to in a nutshell. I think it's important because we live on a finite planet, and these environmental and social pressures from a growing population and growing economy are only increasing. So that is leading all of society, really, but especially for us, our customer and farmers, our customers, and wider food and ag supply chains to really, to rethink things and change what their preferences and expectations are. So that is why I think it's really relevant to our sector. Yeah, one other thing I might add is that I guess I like to think of sustainability issues as being based around value, really, right? And I think historically we've mainly focused on economic value, financial value. Is this creating money or not? But I find it helpful to really kind of consider it from a slightly wider perspective of what about the environmental value that we might be creating or destroying when we undertake any action or business venture, and what about the social, the people value that we might enhance or impair.
Which presumably will have economic impacts in the long term as well, Rob, right? You mentioned, in a world of constrained and finite resources, the risks and impacts associated that we are having from the environmental, social, will also potentially flow through to tangible economic consequences, depending on those impacts that we're having.
Yeah, no, that's right. And, the risks can show up in any number of ways, right? But, increasingly, customers and actors in the supply chain are starting to say, actually, we expect, this sort of minimum standard. And if you're not meeting those, then, at a minimum, you're going to start to see maybe slightly lower value for the products that you're selling.
So you referred to ESG or sustainability risk being quite broad. Let's narrow that focus. Let's bring it down to climate, because that's a big enough beast just in itself. So if we do focus specifically on climate, first of all, what obligations do the bank have, not just Rabobank, but all banks in New Zealand at least, on reporting on climate-related risks and opportunities?
Sure. Yeah, so there is really one main obligation that we have when it comes to climate change, and that is around climate-related disclosures. So, this is legislation that's a couple of years old now. In fact, we're just putting the finishing touches to our second year's report, and it requires us to disclose. It requires all large financial or business entities to disclose on climate change around four themes, and that's governance, strategy, metrics and targets, and risk management.
And what's the purpose of making banks go through this exercise, Rob?
So this is something that I like to try and highlight to our people within the bank, actually, Blake. It's interestingly, this all came about following the global financial crisis, right, way back in 2008, and the governor of the Bank of England back then, Mark Carney, became increasingly concerned that kind of like the housing asset bubble and things that burst back then, we might be seeing a sort of climate-related asset bubble. And so he set about some voluntary guidelines that looked to help businesses understand the potential kind of risks and opportunities that they're facing from climate change, and help them, I guess, to help themselves understand a little bit better the strategy, just take a more strategic approach to climate change, which up till that point, certainly by many, was probably being looked at a bit more tactically. So that was the origins, and the NZ legislation doesn't in some ways deviate massively from that. It explicitly states that the aim is to to help companies sort of help themselves, I guess, if you like, and to support investment in the transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. So it's very much not a sort of, although it's called a disclosure, it's not really a, that is not the reporting. Generic tick box reporting is not the intent.
Okay, so if we start to dig into a little bit about the risks we're exactly talking about when we talk about climate risks, what are we actually referring to there, Rob? What are the broad categories of climate risks that that you and many others look at?
Yeah, so generally people describe climate risks two ways. The first is the obvious one, physical risks, right? And there we can split those up into either so-called acute risks, and they're your extreme weather events, right? Your cyclones, your heavy rainfall, that sort of thing, wildfires, and your chronic events, and that is the temperature rise itself, and alongside that, of course, sea level rise. So that's your physical risk. But then there's also what are called transition risks, and that basically translates to the sort of economic risks, if you like, associated with governments and societies moving their economies to be low carbon, climate resilient. So here you've got things like reputational risk, policy, legal risk, and markets is a big one as well. And technology, yeah.
And arguably that's the category of risk that maybe isn't as well understood because it's, I suppose, comparatively new compared to the physical risk aspect. Farmers are very used to dealing with changing climatic conditions, and you can discuss the speed of change, et cetera, or the nature of change. But by and large, as I said at the start, they understand the concept of, more or less like rain or greater extreme weather events. But that transition risk is probably a new one that we're all trying to get their head around to better understand, and then understand how it's going to flow through to tangible impacts. Before we get there, though, if we go back to the physical risks, I do just want to, I'm keen to get your take on given you've undertaken some analysis on the bank from the bank's perspective of the key risks for our clients from a physical perspective. What were the main physical risks, climate risks that the bank found were facing New Zealand farmers and growers?
Yeah, sure. Just quickly picking up on that transition risk thing, I think that's right, and there's a bit of a juxtaposition there in that when you say climate risk, right, most people, myself included, immediately think of some kind of extreme weather event. But actually, and we know that, whilst we're already starting to see some of those impacts today here including here in New Zealand, actually, we know they're going to play out and gradually increase over the coming decades, and hopefully, only start to get really painful in sort of 20 or 30 years' time. Those transition risks, though, Blake, are already materialising much quicker and have the potential to increase in magnitude, I guess, very quickly, right? Because they're at the will or behest of either policymakers or consumer sentiment. And so
Sorry, I was just going to say, they can be highly unpredictable, right? Both ways. So they Indeed. Can be very quickly, you've got a price on emission or not, or there's a trade barrier or not, and that can change both ways very quickly, which creates a high degree of uncertainty from a risk perspective.
Yeah, and that's obviously, as we all know, that's really unhelpful, right, for farmers and other business sectors, really. So, coming back to the physical risks, I think, when we did our work, we created 3 scenarios. one that saw the world meeting the aims of the Paris Agreement, which is to limit temperature rise to about 1.5 C above pre-industrial levels. And then we did another one. Another scenario, our next scenario was a disorderly scenario, and that's kind of getting to what you were just talking about, Blake, where we see policies enacted and then rolled back. Big delays before we start to see policies, and then people putting strong policies in place because we've waited so long, they become very urgent. And then the final scenario was a sort of let it rip, if you like, scenario, where we just decide that we won't worry about reducing emissions because that's too politically painful, and instead we'll just focus on adaptation. And in all three of those scenarios, we see significant physical impacts, I guess, is the bad news. So the main impacts facing NZ are, as far as we currently see today, drought, heavy precipitation, and cyclones are likely to be the big three. Probably no surprises in me telling you that there, Blake. Possibly a bit more riverine flooding in the near term, although that looks to die off in future because of reduced snow and therefore reduced snow melt. So yeah, overall, I think there's a number of, many other regions, countries around the world that are probably going to be more impacted. We don't see, again, certainly in the next 10 or 20 years, that the bank doesn't see its customer base overall being heavily impacted. But that is a general statement, right? That's averages, and so that masks that there will unfortunately certainly be a number of individual clients who will fall foul of that weather.
Clients and regions, as you've seen already, like I say, you've got to be careful of when talking about averages. We've already seen a couple of key regions across New Zealand that have been repeatedly hit with severe weather events. But as I've already mentioned, I feel our listeners probably have a reasonable understanding of physical risks, or at least can get their head around the concept of physical risks a lot easier than transition risks. So, based on your analysis, what are those key transition risks facing New Zealand farmers and growers that we need to start being aware of, Rob?
Yeah. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, right, we categorize it into about four main buckets. Reputational risk, that's not going to be too much of a concern for the majority of our farming customers because they're not the sort of scale where there's name recognition for those farms. Policy and legal, that's one, right? So we're talking about, is farming going to come into the ECS or is methane going to receive some kind of pricing? Then you've got two that are interesting as well. Markets. This is arguably the biggest risk, I think, as we see customer expectations shift, supply chain expectations, or even requirements shift. That could really start to impact our farmers. And also, I guess to a lesser extent, if we see fossil fuels being taxed more, then that will increase input costs, right? And then we have the technologies. Now, this covers things like disruptive technologies, so dairy alternatives, plant-based meats, which are still pretty niche, right, but growing. And certainly, if you look at regions like Europe, starting to grow at a reasonable rate. But also, this covers things like technologies that help you to reduce your emissions on farm. and if you don't, watch out and keep up with what the rest of the market's doing, you might find that you've not invested enough in those sort of technologies.
So that's about, competitors' technology outpacing your technology to the point they have some form of competitive advantage associated with that technology.
That's right. So, for example, now, some of those leading farmers or ones that are in a position to be able to invest in some of these technologies probably, we know are already doing so, and they'll be seeing some associated benefits to that. But if and when for example, methane emissions are finally priced in, then they're going to see another uptick in the cost advantage that they have over those farmers who've not invested in that, right? And at that point, you might suddenly start to see a real competitive advantage.
And presumably that risk, again, this could potentially go both ways, right? In terms of there's a risk around when and how to apply technology within my farming system, and if you get that wrong, and you've brought in a new cost or a system impact that just doesn't work for whatever reason. So actually, just managing that technology transition is the overall risk, and it's not a case of, hey, first and fastest is always going to be best. That may or may not be the case. It's just how you manage that technology integration into your system, I assume.
Yeah, no, that's right. What's it they say in stock markets? Being early is the same as being wrong. Yeah. So yes, it's tricky times, and for sure that you can potentially invest in things that aren't going to work out for you. So yeah, we all need to be careful in selecting how we manage those emission solutions.
And grows, Rob, are there any sort of other broader risks that that the sector or system needs to be taking into consideration as a whole?
Yeah, no, there absolutely is actually, Blake. So what our work with the scenario analysis highlighted to us is that we've just been talking about all those risks, sort of risk to individual farmers. But if we think about the more systemic risks, they can be very strong, right? So if, for example, State Highway 1 goes down, or we lose a major national port, they're very much beyond control of farmers, no matter how resilient you make your business, and have the potential to impact a large swathe of our sector in one go. And also, even on a slightly wider scale, again, if we just think about how some of these the economic impacts, for example, from repeated extreme weather events around the world, they could lead to a economic depression, and so how does that then actually feed through into demand for the produce that we make? Yes,
I mean, obviously there's a lot we could delve into there, and that's probably the subject of not just a podcast, but a series of podcasts. But before we move on from the risk discussion, Rob, just keen to get your take on the nature and degree of these risks. Are they likely to hit all farming types and regions in a similar way, or are we likely to see quite significant differences depending on what and how you farm?
Yeah, so there are going to be differences, of course, and you already mentioned, Blake, that some of those regional differences, and we don't expect to suddenly start seeing like cyclones in the very southern part of the country, for example. So regions that already have some of those risks that is likely to be exacerbated. Having said that, I guess something like drought is probably going to the much wider part of the country is potentially exposed to that. So those existing kind of hot spots, we expect to stay there, broadly speaking. What you're farming, of course, makes a difference. Horticulture and arable farming is going to be much more concerned about these physical impacts, whereas dairy and sheep and beef more insulated. And of course, now we're sort of getting into that conversation around impacts versus resilience, I guess, right? And what sort of, depending on what sort of farming business you have, depends on your resilience. So, our sheep and beef farmers, I know, have been going through a bit of a tough time of it over the last couple of years, and so that probably leaves them at the moment a little bit more vulnerable because they just don't have the same sort of financial resources to repair or build resilience measures into their businesses. But yeah, then it comes down to individual farms, right, and the sort of individual measures that they're taking to mitigate any of those risks that they have.
Yes, I suppose a key takeaway for the listeners there is understand what risks are most material or most relevant to your business, and then understand your resilience to those risks, and then develop a strategy around how you want to develop further resilience to those risks.
For sure.
And I suppose part of the challenge our listeners have when I say something like that as well, there's so much variability and uncertainty there. It's actually really hard to assess some of those risks because there's so much that could change over time. And that sort of leads me to the work that you do for the bank, Rob. The information and data you use to make these assessments and findings. How much confidence can we have in the accuracy of some of this analysis?
Yeah. That's a good question, Blake. We know climate change is complex, right? It's complex and it's nuanced, and it does indeed have, significant deep uncertainty. Having said that, the models are getting better all the time. The science certainly of anthropogenic climate change and whether that is happening is very much settled. And in terms of the work we've done, like Rabo's analysis is certainly, we're starting to get a reasonable level of confidence around that. The direction of travel is clear. Where we start to get more uncertain is around the preciseness of specific locations, specific details. Of course, we can't predict what kind of weather events are going to happen anywhere, right? But in general, the field is constantly improving. More widely, I think, accuracy is growing all the time. Unfortunately, what we tend to see with the improvements in methodologies is that the predictions get of the impacts, the size of the impacts get worse. They don't tend to get better, which is always disappointing to see. We should call out though that there are still big gaps in how some of these climate models and certainly the economic models really tend to assess the economic impacts of climate change, especially those acute ones that I was talking about earlier. So it's easier to kind of say, what will 2-3 degrees temperature rise do for crop yields in X location? It's a lot harder to say, what will X number of increased cyclones at X percent strength, in these regions at these time, all of that kind of additional complexity. So that means that a lot of the models today actually just simply don't include those impacts. And that's led to some very lowballed estimates of how climate change is going to impact our national and international economies. And some of the more recent research paints a much more somber picture of how large some of those GDP losses could be.
That's probably enough somber chat, yep. Rob. Let's flick over to the opportunities, because surely it's not all downside risk. What will be the opportunities available for farmers and growers to capitalise on in relation to changing climate? No,
great, Blake. Let's focus on the opportunities. I really like to emphasise this point. I try and start the kind of conversations around the opportunities, although frequently fail to do so. I think there's lots of opportunities, and that's where we should focus. So, at its core, I think it's about maintaining and building our competitive economic edge, right? So many of the measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example, should also lead to wider efficiency gains for your business, be that reducing your input costs or what have you. Another one is markets, right? So as we do start to see sustained significant increases in temperatures, we're already starting to see new crops in more northern parts of the country start to be considered and planted. And then more widely across the nation, you've got opportunities for things like carbon farming, right, for planting forests and gaining, planting forests on perhaps traditionally unproductive land and gaining carbon credits and the rent from that. And then you've got one as well, which is, I guess, more around enhancing resilience, right? So we talk about adapting to climate change and enhancing resilience, but we shouldn't overlook the fact that also helps enhance your resilience to those day-to-day weather events that maybe in the past you would have been quite exposed to. Actually, in the future, hopefully, a lot less. Oh, and also just one other thing. I think we need to look for the, talking about sort of uncertainty and how farmers make decisions in that uncertainty, right? Let's look for the wins, the opportunity, the actions that will protect us, but also make sense and make sense around things like improving soil health, improving animal welfare. The cost efficiencies I just talked about, and enhancing our wider sort of communities and workforce as well.
Yeah, so it's actually about focusing on the opportunities. When you realise that we talked a lot about uncertainties of some of the risks, whether they may or may not eventuate. Those opportunities that you're talking about, we know they're there. The opportunities for a lot of them are there. So maybe it's around focusing on the opportunities that are there that you can realise that as a result will potentially actually mitigate or manage some of those uncertain risks that are sort of lingering in the background at the same time. Rather than the other way around, focusing on these risks that you've got to your business, maybe it's running towards the opportunities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Blake.
Look, I think that's been incredibly enlightening, Rob, and I feel we've already covered a lot. As I said, you could probably write record a series of, in fact, probably people do, to be fair, series on this topic. But before we move on, any final thoughts or takeaways for our listeners?
A couple of things. So, I think climate change is in many ways are just an extension of business as usual for farmers, right? It's another kind of change in conditions and the markets. So it's really just about how they best respond, like I say, getting that information, focusing on the opportunities. But yeah, I think now is really probably the time to start doing that, start looking at it and planning and acting, right? And it's that old adage, which is an oldie but a goodie. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now.
Yeah, but just to be clear to our listeners, Rob, you're not advocating we all go out and plant trees, right?
No,
there's a time and place, but the key message isn't all run out and plant trees. But yeah, it's the idea you take action now and think a lot more, maybe strategically around this than in the short-term tactical solution, and understanding that these variables and impacts are out there. They will impact your business over the 20-year plus period. Exactly how, when, the nature of that impact are uncertain, but at least trying to factor that into your planning to, again, capitalise on those opportunities and if necessary, mitigate or manage those risks is certainly something that should be, at least one of the considerations within your farming business when you're doing that planning.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that planting a tree analogy did not constitute financial advice.
Excellent. Hey, thank you very much, Rob. Enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, cheers. Bye.